Chapter 1. The Solitary Spellcaster. The tower stood like a jagged scar against the twilight sky. The stone walls, dark with the wear of time and ivy, told stories of forgotten nights and whispered curses. Liara had spent countless hours under the heavy weight of those stones, surrounded by the quiet murmur of magic that thickened the air like smoke. There wasn't much left in the world she called home, but this place was hers. No one bothered her here, and that was just fine by her. Inside, the flickering glow of candles danced across the room, casting long shadows on the walls, cluttered with books, scrolls, and arcane tools that spoke of the past, mysterious, powerful, and dangerous. The scent of old parchment mixed with the earthy tang of the tower's crumbling stone. Liara's hands moved with a practiced precision, her fingers brushing over the delicate ink as she transcribed the incantation, the symbols falling neatly in the margins of her well-worn journal. She muttered the words under her breath. A few cracks of static filled the air, a sign her spell was taking shape. It was nothing grand, just a simple binding spell, to keep the energies from straying too far. Nothing more than a shadow of the powers she'd seen in the old tomes, nothing that would make anyone take notice. She didn't mind. The last thing she needed was to draw attention. Her eyes glanced toward the open window, where the dusk had turned the world outside into a mess of bleeding reds and purples. The night always felt like a better place to be, wrapped in the secrecy of the dark. She let her gaze linger, but the moment passed. Her attention snapped back to the journal, and she scribbled down another set of symbols. It was the routine. The same damn routine. And it was working, if not for the ache that pulled at her insides like a weight. The weight of knowing that, despite all her practice, despite all the hours spent trying to control it, her magic wasn't ever going to make her whole. There were whispers in the magical community, whispers she didn't dare to listen to, that her powers were a curse, that her gifts, necromancy, the ability to twist the very essence of life and death, had too much potential for destruction, that there was no place for a woman like her. That she'd never find the balance. They were probably right, but it didn't stop her from hoping, just a little, that one day someone might see her magic as something to be revered, instead of feared. A rustling from the corner pulled her from her thoughts. The raven, perched silently on the window-sill, regarded her with one beady black eye. It had been her companion for as long as she could remember, a constant presence in the silence of her solitude. She had no idea how the bird had come to be enchanted, only that it had followed her when she first moved into the tower, and it had never left. Perhaps it wasn't quite a pet, but it had become something of a confidant. She cracked a thin smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. "What do you think, old friend? Am I just wasting time here?" The raven tilted its head, a knowing look in its dark eyes. She couldn't tell if it was trying to comfort her or mock her, but then, it never did much to comfort her, did it? It just sat there waiting, watching her quietly, its presence a constant reminder that she was just a solitary witch in a world that had no place for someone like her. She sighed, her pen stilling against the paper. The raven flapped its wings, the sound echoing in the hollow space. Liara sat back in her chair, rubbing her temples. There was no one here to tell her if she was getting any closer to the answers she sought, no one to guide her on the path. She'd just keep doing what she did best, working her magic alone, hoping the answers would eventually find their way to her. But part of her, just a small part, buried deep under layers of doubt, wondered if there was more out there. She let the thought slip from her mind as quickly as it came. No, it was foolish to believe that. The world had no use for people like her. She turned her attention back to the journal. One more incantation, one more night of practice. The raven fluttered, its wings brushing the air, but it made no sound. It knew. They both knew. Tomorrow would come, and she would be in the same place, doing the same thing. Alone. Just like always. But tonight, as she traced the final symbols in the journal, there was a strange pull in the air, a slight shift that she couldn't quite place. She frowned. The candlelight flickered one last time, and the room fell into a deep silence that didn't feel natural. The raven ruffled its feathers, its sharp eyes narrowing in her direction, as if it sensed something. Liara paused, her fingers hovering above the journal. Something wasn't right. Then, without warning, the air crackled with an energy she couldn't ignore, a powerful surge that rattled her bones, as if the very walls of the tower had shuddered in response. She could feel it now, the magic, thick and heavy, stirring in the dark corners of the room. And just like that, she realized, she was no longer alone. The silence in the tower was thick enough to suffocate you. It had been that way for as long as Liara could remember. The wind outside howled like a dying animal pressing against the stone, begging for entry. Inside, the candlelight was all she had, just a handful of flickering flames, too weak to keep the shadows at bay. She wasn't sure which was more familiar, the oppressive solitude or the echo of her own heartbeat. Then came the knock. Low, soft, almost too quiet to hear. Liara's hand froze over her journal. Her pulse quickened, but she didn't move. A trick of the wind, that was all. She waited, watching the door like it might open of its own accord. Another knock. Louder this time, deliberate. Her breath caught in her throat. Someone was out there. The tower had no visitors, not in years. She wasn't expecting anyone, and no one should have known she was here. Her fingers tightened around her pen, then released it. Slowly she stood, making her way to the door with the care of someone who didn't want to make a sound. When she opened it, she found no one standing there. But there was something else. A slip of parchment lay on the ground, sealed with a deep crimson wax. She knelt to retrieve it, the cool air brushing her skin as she broke the seal. The message was simple, scrawled in hurried, untidy handwriting, "They are coming." Her brow furrowed. Who were they, and why now, after all this time? A low, gravelly voice interrupted her thoughts. "You've been expecting them, haven't you, witch?" She snapped around, her hand instinctively moving toward the dagger she kept hidden at her belt. A figure stood in the corner of the room, barely visible in the shadows. She hadn't heard him enter, hadn't felt the presence until his voice broke the stillness. The man was old, hunched over, his face weathered like a map of forgotten roads, his clothes tattered but somehow still holding a shred of dignity. His eyes, pale and distant, studied her with the detachment of someone who'd seen too much. "I don't know who you are," Liara said, her voice tight. She reached for the nearest spellbook. "But if you've come to make trouble—" The old man raised a hand, stopping her. His fingers were long and thin, like the branches of a tree gnarled by time. "Trouble?" He smiled. It was not a warm smile. "I come with nothing but the truth. A truth you've spent your life avoiding." Lyra's grip on the book tightened, but she didn't move to strike. Not yet. "You've heard the stories," the old man continued, his voice rasping like dry leaves in the wind. "The legend of the 4 warriors, the ones whose blood is tied to the moon, cursed and bound to a mate they've yet to find." Lyra's heart skipped a beat. The legends were old, whispered in the corners of taverns, lost to time like so many other things. Werewolves, powerful, dangerous creatures whose fate was intertwined with that of one woman, one mate. A deep, instinctual part of her reacted, a pull she couldn't explain. She suppressed it, forcing herself to focus. "I've heard the stories," Liara replied, her voice guarded. "I don't see what they have to do with me." "Everything," the old man said. His eyes gleamed, piercing through her with an unnerving clarity. "You are the one they seek, the one their fate has always demanded, the one their curse has always craved." Lyra's stomach twisted. Their curse? The words echoed in her mind like the final toll of a bell. "You're insane," she muttered. But deep down, something unsettled her, a nagging sense that this wasn't just some madman rambling. The old man laughed, low and bitter, You won't believe it until it happens, but you've felt it, haven't you? The power stirring inside you. The weight of something greater than yourself pulling at your soul. You might not know it yet, but you were born to walk that path. Leah took a step back, shaking her head. Her eyes darted to the raven perched in the corner. It watched her with its glossy black eyes as if it too understood something she couldn't. The old man stepped forward, his voice softening. You are destined, witch. The 4 warriors, their fate is tied to yours. Their blood calls to you. Your magic will either break their curse, or it will shackle you all to a fate worse than death. She swallowed hard. Her heart pounded in her chest, and for the first time in years doubt crept into her thoughts. Was it possible? The legends. They spoke of a bond between a werewolf and their mate, a bond so deep that it defied everything, even death itself. I don't need your prophecy, Liara said, her voice sharper than she intended. She turned away, trying to steady the sudden rush of fear she felt. I'm not some girl for your warriors to find. I'm a witch. I don't— Run if you must, the old man interrupted, his tone stern. But the moon is rising, and the 4 will come for you, whether you want them or not. Liara stopped, her back to him, staring into the flickering shadows. His words lingered in the air like a curse. Her hand trembled against the stone wall, the weight of destiny pressing down on her chest like 1,000 invisible hands. Could it be true? Could these warriors, these creatures of myth, really be coming for her? Her breath caught in her throat. Something in her had always known. There was power in her magic, an untapped well of it. But this was beyond her understanding. And if the old man was right, it wasn't just her power she was about to confront. It was something that had been waiting for centuries. She closed her eyes, letting the air thicken with the weight of his words. The 4 warriors, and the mate. And then, almost imperceptibly, she felt it. A shift in the air, a cold chill that wasn't just the wind, a whisper deep inside her soul that told her something had changed. Her fate was no longer her own. Go now, the old man said, his voice fading like smoke in the night. They're coming. The 4 are closer than you think. Liara stood frozen, the candlelight flickering wildly around her, the shadows dancing on the walls. And for the first time in her life, she felt the weight of something greater than her own hands. Something that had been waiting. And now it was here. The air in the chamber was thick with a charged electric pulse, a hum that vibrated through the stone floor up into her bones and settled in the pit of her stomach. Outside the wind howled, but here, inside the secret chamber of her tower, the night was still. The only sound was the steady drip of wax from the flickering candles, casting long, crooked shadows across the room. The moon, full and raw, hung low in the sky, cutting through the thin curtains, its silvery light spilling across the cluttered space. A rare lunar eclipse was nearing. Liara could feel it. She could taste the power in the air, sharp and sweet, like the edge of a blade. Liara stood before a low stone altar, the surface cluttered with vials, ancient tomes, and symbols scratched hastily into the stone. Her fingers brushed over the ingredients she had gathered, rare herbs that whispered of forbidden magic, crystals that hummed with an energy all their own. A vial of blood-red liquid the color of sacrifice. She took a breath, steadying herself. This was her choice, no one else's, but the price was steep, and she knew it. A hand hovered over the crystal, glowing faintly under the moon's light, and then moved to the blood vial. The ritual was more than just a test of power, it was a gamble. The ancient texts warned against it, warned about the consequences of what could be unleashed if she didn't know exactly what she was doing. But nothing about this path was certain, and Liara knew all too well that the deeper you reached into the dark, the less light there was to guide you back. She poured the liquid into a bowl, her eyes flicking nervously to the darkened corners of the room. The raven, perched silently on a rafter, watched her intently, its eyes gleaming in the candlelight. It had seen her in her solitude, in her studies, in her failures. But tonight was different. Tonight, she was doing more than just seeking knowledge. She was reaching beyond what she understood, beyond the boundaries she'd kept for so long. Her fingers twitched. The air felt heavier now, as though something else had stepped into the room with her, something unseen but present. She set the vial aside and reached for the grimoire, turning its brittle pages, hands trembling, searching for the final words. The ritual had been written centuries ago by someone long dead, someone who had known the risks, but had pushed forward anyway. The words on the page blurred in the low light. She needed to do this. She had to know. She couldn't hide in this tower forever, couldn't pretend the world outside wasn't pulling at her. The raven ruffled its wings, breaking her focus for a moment, and she cursed under her breath. "Focus, Liara," she whispered to herself. "Focus." With a determined exhale, she began to speak the words aloud. The first syllables tasted strange on her tongue, foreign and old, but they came easily. The next came harder, more insistent, like the air was resisting her command. The symbols on the altar glowed faintly as though alive, responding to her voice. The moonlight intensified, casting an otherworldly glow across the room. She was threading a needle between two worlds, and she could feel it. The pull. Her pulse quickened as the words left her lips, the power surging through the air. The raven let out a single, sharp caw, as though sensing the shift in the room. Liara felt it too. The ground seemed to tremble beneath her, the walls narrowing in, closing her off from everything except the ritual. A shudder ran through her body. Her hands trembled, and for a split second doubt crept in. Maybe this wasn't worth the cost. But there was no turning back now. She had come too far. The magic was already flowing through her, coiling like smoke through her veins, both intoxicating and terrifying. The eclipse was nearly upon them, and Liara's mind raced with the consequences. What if something went wrong? What if she had miscalculated? Magic had a price, and those who reached too far were often lost in its depths, consumed by forces they didn't understand. "It has to work," she thought, her breath shallow. "It has to." She finished the incantation. The last word left her mouth in a breathless rush, and the world seemed to stop. The air crackled, the room lit with a blinding light. For a moment Liara couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Her heart hammered in her chest, the blood rushing in her ears. The raven screeched, a terrible sound that pierced her thoughts. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the light died down. The air was thick, oppressive, and Liara staggered back, gasping for breath. Her hands shook, and her mind was a whirl of confusion and wonder. Nothing had happened. The silence in the room was deafening, and Liara stood frozen, waiting for something, anything, to show itself. But nothing came. No explosion of magic, no dark shadow rising from the depths. She let out a long, slow breath, disappointment settling in her stomach like a rock. Had she failed? Had she gone too far? Then it hit her, a cold chill that ran down her spine, as if something was watching her. The raven was still perched, its eyes wide, its body rigid. Liara turned toward the window, the reflection of the moon casting a distorted shadow across the room. There, standing just beyond the glass, was a figure, a silhouette too tall to be human, its presence too solid to be an illusion. Her heart stopped. Her breath hitched in her throat. The ritual had worked. The forces she'd awakened had already begun to respond, and they were coming. Liara's breath caught in her throat as the final word of the incantation left her lips. The air around her hummed, thick with tension, and for a moment it seemed as though everything had stopped. The silence was oppressive, like the calm before a storm. But there was something else, something unseen, pushing at the edges of the room, squeezing at the walls. Then it came, a violent surge of energy, sharp and biting, like a fist to the gut. The air crackled as if the very atmosphere had been stretched too thin, ready to snap. The candlelight flickered wildly, casting warped, erratic shadows across the room. The floor beneath her feet shuddered, and Liara staggered, her knees weak from the sudden, overwhelming force. The raven let out a shrill cry and fluttered to the rafters, its sharp eyes fixed on her, as if it too could sense the madness that had been unleashed. For a moment she couldn't breathe. A pulse of energy exploded from the center of the altar, rippling outward in waves, turning the room into a blur of light and shadow. She caught glimpses of shapes, luminous and shifting, flickering in the air, like ghosts made of fire. The mists rolled in thick and fast, swirling around her like a living thing, pressing in, suffocating her. The scent of earth and iron clung to the air, sharp and metallic, stinging her nostrils. Liara's heart pounded in her chest, a cold sweat breaking out across her brow. Her hands trembled as she clutched at the edge of the altar, trying to steady herself. She had expected power, she had expected something, but not this. Not this. The mists parted with an unnatural howl, and before her the figures materialized. There were 4 of them. Tall, hulking shapes, their outlines still blurred by the smoke and light, but their presence unmistakable. Each one exuded power, dark and primal, the kind that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand at attention. Their faces were hidden in shadows, their forms too strong, too real to be just phantoms. There was a weight to them, a gravity that drew her in and made her breath catch in her throat. They were alive, or something close to it. Her legs nearly gave out from under her as the room seemed to spin. Her pulse raced, every instinct screaming at her to flee. But she couldn't move. Her feet were rooted to the ground as the first figure stepped forward, the mists parting before him like a curtain. The light of the moon caught his form, and Liara felt her heart skip a beat. His eyes, dark, fierce, and glowing with an unnatural light. Wolf's eyes. There was something ancient about them, something savage, like a storm waiting to break. His face was a mix of human and something far more dangerous, a perfect balance of strength and raw animal power. His hair, thick and wild, hung in waves around his face, and a dark scar ran across his cheek, a mark of battles fought and won. The second figure moved, just as imposing, his body rippling with a kind of muscle that didn't belong to any human she knew. His features were sharp, intense. His lips were drawn into a grim line, and Liara could feel the weight of his gaze, cold and piercing, even from across the room. The third one, his presence just as commanding, had a face she couldn't quite place. Too sharp to be human, too haunting to be anything else. His fur was darker, almost black, and as his eyes locked onto hers, Liara felt a tug deep in her chest. Her pulse stuttered, the strange, foreign sensation growing in the pit of her stomach. The fourth one stood a little apart from the others, a figure carved from shadow and light, his stature taller than the rest. His features were more refined, his eyes a cold blue that seemed to see right through her, cutting deeper than any human eyes ever could. There was a pain in his gaze, an unspoken agony that seemed to haunt him, gnawing at the edges of his expression. Liara's breath caught in her throat as she felt the weight of their gaze upon her. 4 warriors, 4 souls bound by something far greater than her magic. She could feel it in the air, the way the room pulsed with energy, the way her skin tingled under their stare. This wasn't just a ritual gone wrong. This was something else entirely. What have I done? Her mind raced, her heart hammering in her chest, torn between wonder and terror. The stories had always been clear, fated mates, the bond of blood, the transformation of destiny, but to see it, to feel it in her very bones. It was too much, too real. She had summoned them. These were the werewolves of legend, the cursed warriors who had wandered the world for centuries, bound by their own magic, their own pain, and now they were here, standing before her, their fates inexplicably tied to hers. Her knees nearly gave out from under her, but she didn't fall. She couldn't. Not when they were looking at her like that. Each one of them, their eyes locked onto hers with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. They were here, and she was at the center of it all. She could feel their power, their need, and deep within her something stirred. Something wild and primal. Her magic had summoned them, but something else had tethered them to her. This was no longer a simple experiment. This was no longer just about magic or power. The very essence of her being was tied to them, and no matter how much she wanted to run, there was nowhere left to hide. The silence in the room was deafening. No one spoke. No one moved. Liara could feel their pain, their fury, their need to break free of whatever curse had bound them. "They've been waiting for me," she thought. "All this time they've been waiting for me." And that, more than anything, terrified her. Chapter 2. The Weight of Destiny. Dawn cracked over the horizon, a faint light bleeding into the dark corners of the room. The sky, streaked with blood orange and pale pink, bled through the grimy windows. The silence felt wrong. It wasn't the quiet of peace. It was the kind of stillness you get after something has broken. Something irreparable. The tower, once a place of solitude, now hummed with a restless energy. The echoes of howls, deep, wild, full of ancient pain, still rang in her ears. It was the sound of something ancient, something untamed, rising from its slumber, awakening to a world it had long forgotten. Liara stood motionless in the center of the room, the remnants of the ritual scattered around her like the debris from a storm. Crumbled pages, cracked crystals, shards of glass littered the stone floor. Her heart thudded in her chest, too fast, too erratic, like it was trying to beat its way out of her body. She should have known better. She should have felt the danger sooner. Her hand shook as she reached down to pick up the last piece of parchment, the incantation she had spoken. The words still lingered in the air, curling around her like smoke. The wrong kind of smoke, the kind that would choke you before you could run. The pieces of the ritual didn't fit together anymore. They were scattered, broken, like pieces of a puzzle she wasn't meant to solve. What have I done? The thought repeated in her head, faster now, gnawing at her insides. She looked around the room, but it felt wrong, too big, too empty. The shadows in the corners seemed to stretch longer than they should have, and she couldn't shake the feeling that they were watching her. She paced the length of the room barefoot, her steps quick and uneven. The floor, cold beneath her feet, did nothing to steady her. Every time she crossed a space, her eyes darted to the shadows, half expecting one of them to step out from the darkness. The 4 warriors, their power, their rage, it was too much for her to handle. She had never been meant for this. "I never asked for this," she thought bitterly. Stopping in front of the altar, her eyes scanning the symbols carved into the stone. They glowed faintly in the dim light, an eerie reminder of the power she had just unleashed. She shook her head. She was supposed to be in control. This was supposed to be a test, a way to push her limits. But now it felt like a trap she'd set for herself. Her mind was still reeling from the events of the night. Too many emotions, too many thoughts racing all at once. What if I can't control them? What if I've made a mistake too big to undo? The question hung in the air like a fog. Every time she considered it, she found herself looking for a way out, an escape from the weight of responsibility that pressed down on her chest like a boulder. But where was she supposed to go? What was she supposed to do now? The warriors weren't just bound to her in the ritual. They were connected to her, whether she wanted it or not. And worse, she was their fated mate, a bond deeper than magic, deeper than anything she could have imagined. Her gaze shifted to the window, where the first light of day broke through the clouds. The sun, weak and sickly, cast long shadows across the tower. It was a reminder that the night was over, that whatever had been unleashed was now real, and there was no hiding from it, no turning back. She squeezed her eyes shut. She couldn't do this. She couldn't handle this kind of power, not when it came with the weight of 4 warriors whose fates were now tied to hers. She wasn't ready for any of it. She had spent her life studying the dark arts, perfecting her magic in isolation, thinking it would protect her. But now she realized the truth. It wasn't protection she needed. It was control, and she didn't have it. Liara rubbed her temples, willing the headache to subside. Her mind felt scattered, fraying at the edges. She thought back to their faces, those eyes, the way they had looked at her, their pain, their hunger, their need. "They're waiting for me," she thought. "They've been waiting for me." The thought left a hollow feeling in her chest, like something was missing, but it was nothing she could fix. And deep down she knew that it wasn't just them waiting for her. It was her too. She had felt the pull, the undeniable tug in her soul. The bond between them was more than just fate. It was a connection, a primal one, a bond she couldn't shake, even if she tried. She turned away from the altar, her back to the window. The room seemed smaller now, darker. The air itself felt thick with tension, as if it had absorbed all of her fear and doubt, and now it was just waiting for her to act. "What if they don't accept me?" she thought. "What if they see me as a weakness?" Her hands clenched into fists at her sides. She couldn't afford to be weak. She couldn't afford to second-guess herself. Not now. Not when the warriors, the 4 who had crossed realms to find her, were counting on her. She had a choice, to take control or to let this fate swallow her whole. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to press closer, watching her, waiting. Liara's chest tightened, and she took a slow, steadying breath. She wasn't sure what she was afraid of more, the power she'd summoned or the power she would have to wield to stop it. Whatever happened next, there was no turning back, not now. Not when she could still hear the howls of the warriors echoing in the depths of her mind. Liara stepped forward, determination starting to seep into her bones. There was no way out, not anymore. She would have to face this, no matter how big the consequences. The tower had been her refuge, but now it was just the beginning, and the weight of destiny had already found her. Liara's fingers brushed the edge of the dusty mirror, the glass cold and unnervingly smooth under her touch. It was an antique, old, almost ancient, and framed in dark iron that twisted like a snake. She had used it for years, a silent companion, a way to peer into the deepest parts of herself. Tonight, though, it felt like an intrusion. The reflection staring back at her was not her own, at least not the woman she recognized. Her eyes were wide, haunted, and her breath shallow. The air in the room felt too thick, too heavy, like it was pressing against her chest, suffocating her. She hadn't expected it to be like this. She hadn't expected any of this. The mirror's surface rippled, the glass distorting like water. Liara's reflection shifted, and for a moment she thought she saw one of the warriors standing behind her, his eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. She spun around quickly. Nothing, just shadows. The raven was perched in the corner, watching her with those unblinking eyes. Its feathers gleamed dark, almost too dark to be natural, and its gaze cut through the silence like a blade. "You think I can handle this?" she whispered under her breath, not sure if the question was for the bird or herself. "You think this is something I can just do?" The raven didn't answer, of course. It never did, but it tilted its head slightly, almost in acknowledgement, as if it knew, somehow, that the weight of destiny was pressing in on her from all sides. Liara turned back to the mirror. The woman staring back at her was still the same, no different than the one who had stood there the day before that. But something had changed. She could feel it, like the room itself had shifted with the arrival of the warriors. She had called them, after all. She had unleashed them. Her pulse quickened. The room seemed to close in on her, the shadows pressing in tighter, pushing at her skin. She hated it, hated the pull, the way their faces haunted her every waking moment, the way their eyes, those damn eyes, followed her everywhere. She could feel their need, their silent plea, the bond between them that was now unmistakable, unbreakable. But she didn't want it. She didn't want them. The words hit her like a blow to the gut. "I don't want this." The raven flapped its wings, the sound sharp and discordant in the stillness. It was as if it could sense her hesitation, as if it could hear the part of her soul screaming to shut down, to lock the door and hide, to never face the warriors again. She wanted to be alone again, back in the tower, safe in her isolation, where the world could be kept at arm's length. The mirror rippled again, the surface distorting like smoke curling through water. Her reflection blurred, and she saw their faces, each one fierce and yearning. The warrior with the scar over his eye, the one with the tortured gaze, the silent, cold one, the one who stood apart from the rest. Each face was a silent plea for something she wasn't sure she could give. She gripped the edge of the mirror, her knuckles white, her breath coming faster now. The pull between them, between her and them, was so strong. The bond, the curse, whatever it was too much. "I don't want this," she whispered again, the words breaking apart as soon as they left her lips. She did want it, though. She could feel it. The weight of their need, the hunger, the bond that was already taking shape, binding them together in ways she couldn't understand. It wasn't just the magic. It wasn't just a curse. It was something deeper, something primal. Her reflection in the mirror stared back at her with eyes full of understanding. And something else, too. Something that made her heart race in fear. She had been running from it for so long. The thought that she could be the one to end their curse, to answer that silent plea, to be the thing they needed. But she couldn't bear the responsibility. She had spent so many years in isolation. She had chosen this life for a reason, because she had believed that she was safer alone, that the world would be better off if she stayed out of it. She didn't have the strength to deal with fate, with the power she had summoned. She couldn't, not when it would mean unraveling everything she had built for herself. Not when it meant them, the warriors, the bond, the future she did not want. The mirror shattered. A crack ran down the surface, and the room seemed to breathe with her. Her pulse hammered in her throat, the silence deafening, like the world was holding its breath, waiting for her next move. "Get out of my head," she muttered, but the words fell flat. The raven watched her in silence, its black eyes too knowing for comfort. The glass shards on the floor reflected the moonlight, and for a brief moment the room grew cold. Liara bent down, reaching for the pieces, her fingers brushing over the sharp edges. Her thoughts raced, faster than she could catch them, darting from one fear to another. She had called them. She had summoned the warriors. But that didn't mean she was ready to face them. Liara rose, stepping away from the mess. She had made her bed. Now she had to lie in it. But not yet. Not today. Maybe tomorrow. Maybe the next day. She wasn't sure she could do it. Not now. Not when the weight of the world seemed to settle on her shoulders, like a burden too heavy to bear. "I'll figure this out," she whispered to the raven. But she didn't believe it. The raven tilted its head again, its eyes gleaming in the dim light. Then, without another sound, it flew out of the room, leaving Liara alone once more. The silence wrapped around her like a shroud, and for the first time, Liara didn't feel safe. The moon hung low in the sky, a pale silver disk against the black velvet of the night. It cast its light over the land, the countryside stretching out in front of her like an endless expanse of shadows and whispering winds. Liara kept her head down, her cloak pulled tight around her shoulders, as if she could shield herself from the world by hiding beneath its fabric. Her footsteps crunched softly over the dry earth as she walked, the familiar path now feeling foreign beneath her feet. The wilderness around her was thick. Dense trees tangled in vines, their skeletal branches reaching out like arms, their limbs clawing at the sky. She knew the woods well, had walked these paths many times, but tonight was different. There was something heavier in the air, something that made the silence feel oppressive, rather than comforting. She had told herself she would never leave the tower, that she would never answer the call, but here she was, walking into the unknown. The warriors' faces still haunted her mind, their hunger, their pain, the bond that tugged at her from within. She had called them into existence, and now she was walking toward the one person who might know how to undo it all, or at least teach her how to control it. The arcane archive, an ancient library hidden deep within the grove, was her only hope. She pressed on, her breath shallow, her feet moving almost of their own accord. Her thoughts kept drifting back to the tower, to the cold emptiness she had left behind. Her haven, the place where she could always hide from the world. It wasn't easy, leaving it. The fear of stepping out of her comfort zone had always kept her from exploring what lay beyond, but now, for the first time, she wasn't running away from her past, she was running toward her future, even if she didn't know what that future would look like. She shook her head, pushing the thoughts aside. There was no time to dwell on fear, not anymore. She had a purpose now, even if she didn't fully understand it. The warriors weren't going to wait for her to figure it out. They were already too close. Suddenly, the ground shifted beneath her. A low growl echoed through the trees, a sound that seemed to ripple through the air itself. She stopped dead in her tracks, her senses sharpening. The familiar hum of magic pulsed through her, the hairs on the back of her neck rising. Out of the darkness, a shadow stepped forward, a creature with glowing eyes, its silhouette massive against the moonlit sky. Its fur was dark as midnight, bristling with energy. Lyra's heart skipped a beat, her fingers twitching toward the dagger at her side, but before she could react, the creature let out a soft growl and retreated back into the shadows. She exhaled slowly, her pulse still pounding in her chest. It wasn't the first time she'd encountered such creatures, magical guardians, spirits of the forest, and entities that didn't belong in this world. But this one had been different. There was a strange familiarity about it, something that tugged at her memory, like she had seen it before. The guardians of the path, she thought. It was a test, a warning, to see if she was worthy of continuing her journey. She hadn't made it this far by accident. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. The air felt thick again, the weight of magic pressing down on her like a physical thing. She couldn't turn back now, not when she was so close to the answers she needed. The path before her seemed to open up as she continued, the trees giving way to a clearing, and there it was, the arcane archive. It was a structure unlike anything she had ever seen, an ancient stone edifice half swallowed by the forest itself. The stones were carved with symbols she recognized, runes of power, runes of protection. The door was ajar, the faint light of an inner fire casting shadows over the stone steps that led inside. Lyra paused before the threshold, the enormity of what she was about to do settling in her chest like a weight. She had spent her life hiding from the world, burying herself in the pursuit of knowledge, keeping everyone at arm's length. But the life she had built was no longer enough. She had a greater purpose now, and if she was ever going to master the power she had unleashed, she needed to learn the truth. And that truth was locked inside this ancient place. Taking a steadying breath, Lyra stepped inside. The moment she crossed the threshold, the air shifted, the light grew dimmer, the shadows deeper, but there was something about it that felt familiar, like it had always been waiting for her. The silence inside was thick, the only sound the faint crackle of the fire in the hearth, the soft rustling of pages, and the ever-present hum of magic. As her eyes adjusted to the low light, she saw him. The mentor, Arion. He sat at a wooden desk, his hands folded before him, his gaze fixed on her with an intensity that made her feel as though he could see straight through to her soul. His robes were worn, but there was an undeniable strength to him, an ancient power that made him both reassuring and unsettling at the same time. "You've come," he said, his voice soft but carrying an unmistakable authority. "I wondered how long it would take." Lyra nodded, though the words she wanted to speak caught in her throat. She felt small here, as though the weight of centuries bore down on her shoulders, but she steeled herself. She was here for answers. She wasn't going to back down now. "I need your help," she said, her voice steady despite the storm brewing inside her. "I've made a terrible mistake. I've unleashed something that might destroy everything." Arion didn't move. didn't even blink. His eyes remained fixed on hers, unwavering. "You've done more than unleash something. You've awakened a destiny that was always meant to be. And now you will learn what it means to carry the weight of it." Lyra's heart skipped a beat. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words wouldn't come. He finally spoke again, his voice low, carrying the weight of centuries. "You were never meant to live in isolation, Lyra. You were meant to rise. But first, you must understand what you've called forth." She swallowed hard, feeling the enormity of her choice settle deep in her bones. This was it. There was no turning back now. She wasn't sure if she was ready, but she knew she had no choice. "Show me what I need to do," she said, her voice a little quieter now, but firm. "Show me how to fix this." The sage nodded. "Then come, and let me show you the path." The air in the archive was thick with the weight of centuries. The scent of old paper, dried ink, and the faintest trace of burning incense hanging in the stillness. Lyra stepped deeper into the room, her heart hammering a little louder with every step, as if the space itself were trying to suffocate her. It wasn't fear she felt, not exactly. It was something heavier, something she didn't have a name for yet. The silence, the history of it all, pressed against her like a wall. Then, in the shadows cast by the flickering light of the hearth, he appeared. Arion. He sat at a wooden desk, his hands folded before him. The movement was slow, deliberate. His silver hair fell in soft waves around his face, and his eyes, pale blue, were like twin shards of ice that could slice through any pretense. There was a calm to him, a stillness that made the world feel suddenly smaller. It wasn't just that he radiated power, it was that his presence commanded attention without a single word. Lyra stopped just inside the door, taking him in. The man was old, but there was no frailty in him. His robes were simple, worn with age, but his stature remained strong, unbent by time. Everything about him seemed to speak of patience, of knowledge, of a lifetime spent watching the world turn, unhurried. When his gaze finally settled on her, it was as though he had been expecting her all along. There was no surprise, no judgment in his eyes, just quiet acceptance. "You've come," Arion said, his voice low and even. "I wondered how long it would take." Lyra didn't know how to respond. She had been expecting something, but not this. This calm that seemed to wrap around her like a blanket. She couldn't afford to let herself relax. Not yet. She stepped forward, her feet heavier than she expected. "I didn't know where else to go," she finally said, her voice low. "I need help." Arion didn't move. He simply observed her, his sharp eyes never leaving hers. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, he reached beside him and pulled an ancient scroll from the pile of texts on the desk. He unfurled it with ease, as though it was something he had done 1,000 times. "The warriors you've unleashed," he began, his voice like gravel in the quiet room, "are bound by a curse older than you can imagine. These are no mere legends. They are the remnants of a forgotten time, creatures who were once rulers, warriors, kings of the old world. They are trapped by a magic they cannot escape, unless they find their mate, a mate destined to break the chains that bind them." Lyra's breath caught. The words hit her harder than she expected. She had felt the weight of their need, their hunger. The bond had already started pulling at her, testing her resolve. "Mate?" Lyra asked, her voice betraying the doubt swirling in her stomach. "You mean me?" Arion's gaze softened just slightly. There was something knowing in his eyes, something that made Lyra uncomfortable but also compelled her to listen. "Yes, you are the key, Lyra, the mate, the one who can release them from their curse, and in doing so, release yourself from the prison of your own making." Lyra stepped back, her pulse quickening, her chest tightened. Release herself? She had spent her life hiding from the world, isolating herself from everything she couldn't control. This Was too much? You don't understand, she muttered, shaking her head. I didn't ask for this. I never wanted it. I just wanted to be left alone. Arion didn't flinch. He remained still, calm, waiting. His eyes never left her, the depth of his gaze cutting through her like a blade. The world doesn't ask for what it is given, Liara, he said. Neither do you. But your power, the gift you have, has already chosen its path, and so have you. Liara clenched her fists at her sides, trying to push the surge of anger down. This wasn't what she wanted to hear. Destiny? It felt too much like a trap, a force too big to fight. She had always kept control, her magic, her life, by keeping others away. Now, it felt like everything she had known was slipping through her fingers. Arion stood then, the motion slow, deliberate. His presence filled the room as he moved toward her, closing the distance between them. You have always hidden yourself, Liara, he continued, his voice softer now, like an old friend giving advice. Your magic, your power, your heart. You have kept it all locked away, hoping no one would notice. But you are not meant to hide any longer. The warriors you've called are a part of you now, and you of them. You must learn to harness your power, to accept it, or you will lose everything. Liara swallowed hard. His words dug into her like sharp stones, turning over every fear, every doubt she had buried deep within herself. She had always been afraid of being too much, too powerful, too vulnerable, too seen. But now she had to face the truth. Arion reached out, his hand gently pulling a scroll from the table and passing it to her. It was heavy, worn, the ink faded in places. She took it reluctantly, her fingers brushing against the ancient parchment. Here, he said, the knowledge you need, the keys to understanding the curse and the steps to breaking it. But be warned, the road ahead will not be easy. The warriors are bound to you, but so is the pain of their past. You will need more than magic to navigate it. Liara stared at the scroll in her hands, the weight of it like a stone in her chest. The knowledge was there, the answer was in front of her, and yet she still couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't ready, that she would fail. But what choice did she have? Her gaze shifted back to Arion. And if I can't do it, what happens then? Arion's smile was small, but it carried with it the weight of everything he had seen in his long life. Then you will learn what happens when you don't face what you are meant to, and the world will move on without you. Liara felt a shiver run down her spine. There was no running from this, not any more. She wasn't sure she was ready, but for the first time she wasn't running from herself. With a final glance at Arion, Liara set her jaw. She could either face this or let it consume her. There was no other choice. Chapter 3. Crossing the Threshold. The dawn broke like a bruise, the first light creeping through the narrow slits of the tower's windows, casting long, jagged shadows across the floor. Liara stood at the wooden table, her fingers brushing over the few belongings she had collected over the years. Trinkets and talismans, books full of half-finished spells, the remnants of a life spent in solitude. It wasn't much, and it wasn't enough, but it was all she had. She packed quickly, the weight of the decision heavy on her chest. Every movement felt deliberate, like it was her last act of control. The tower had been her prison, her safe place, and now she was abandoning it, walking away from the only world she had ever known. Her hand lingered over the single candle on the windowsill, the last one she had lit before stepping out. It had been her companion during long nights of study, her solitary light in a world that refused to see her. Now it seemed almost too small in the growing light of day, too fragile to offer the comfort it once did. Without thinking, she reached out, her fingers trembling as they brushed against the candle's wick. The flame flickered for a moment, its weak light struggling against the weight of the morning sun. Then, with a sharp breath, She extinguished it. The silence that followed was deafening. For a moment Liara stood there, looking at the darkened candle, the room now bathed in the harsh, unforgiving light of day. She felt the weight of it, the finality. This was it. She wasn't coming back, not to this place, not to this life. With a final glance around the room, she turned and walked toward the door. Her feet felt heavy with the burden of the unknown, but there was no other way. She couldn't stay here forever. The warriors were waiting. The world was waiting. Her future was waiting. If I stay, I'll drown in it. I'll suffocate. The thought pushed her forward, out into the cold morning air. The landscape stretched before her, wild and untamed, like the world had been waiting for someone to wake it. The road ahead wasn't easy, but it was the only road she could take. As she stepped into the world beyond the tower, she felt a deep pull inside her chest, an ache that was more than just physical. She was leaving behind the only life she had ever known, the only protection she had ever felt. But she wasn't just walking away from the tower, she was walking toward something. Toward them. And that, more than anything, made her heart race with a mixture of fear and determination. This is it! There's no turning back now! The journey was silent at first, the world around her filled only with the sounds of the wind and the soft crunch of her boots on the earth. But the air felt different now, alive in a way it hadn't before. The moment she had left the tower, the world seemed to shift. The sky was wider, the earth deeper. Her senses were heightened, the hum of magic in the air almost palpable, like a presence just beyond her reach. As Liara continued down the winding path, her thoughts were interrupted by a low, primal sound in the distance, a howl, distant but clear. It was followed by another, and then another. They weren't the howls of animals, but of something far more powerful, far more dangerous. The warriors. She could feel them, their presence stirring like a storm just beneath the surface. The ground beneath her feet seemed to shift, a subtle trembling of the earth, as if the world itself had recognized her. She glanced behind her, the familiar forest stretching out in every direction. And then she saw it. Movement in the trees. At first it was a blur, shapes darting in and out of the shadows, but then, one by one, they began to emerge. The werewolves. The first one stepped out from the trees, his massive form half hidden in the shadows. His eyes glowed faintly, a deep amber that flickered with an intensity that almost stopped Liara's heart. He didn't approach her, but the air around him hummed with energy, raw, untamed power that seemed to vibrate through the earth itself. Liara froze, her heart pounding in her chest. The connection was immediate, undeniable. She felt the weight of it deep in her bones. The bond between them had already begun to form, even though she hadn't fully understood it yet. She could feel his presence in every breath, in every step she took. One by one the others emerged, their movements fluid and predatory. They were silent at first, watching her, studying her, and then, slowly, they began to circle, each of them displaying subtle signs of awareness, gestures of respect, territorial markers, the faintest signs of a pack's unspoken communication. Liara's gaze flickered to one of the warriors, his eyes locked onto hers with an intensity that nearly made her stumble. There was pain in those eyes, an old sorrow that seemed to have settled deep within him. But there was something else, too, something more hopeful, a quiet, pleading look that sent a shiver down her spine. "He's waiting for me," she thought. "They all are." The bond between them, fragile and tenuous, was becoming stronger with each passing second. They didn't need words. She could feel it in the air, in the way their eyes held hers, in the way they moved, together, even in silence. And as she stood there, in the heart of the wild, surrounded by these warriors who had been waiting for her, Liara realized something. The world had never been waiting for her to hide. It had been waiting for her to step out, to accept what had always been meant for her. There was no going back now. The warriors turned as one and began to move, their silent steps in unison, a pack bound together by more than just blood. Liara followed, her heart steadying with each step she took into the unknown. The journey had begun, and there was no turning back now. The forest loomed ahead, its dense canopy swallowing the light of the morning sun. The trees were ancient, their twisted trunks reaching up into the sky like the gnarled fingers of forgotten gods. Moss hung thick in the air, and strange, luminous flowers bloomed at the base of the trunks, casting a soft, eerie glow that painted the forest floor with shifting, ghostly colours. It felt like a dream, but it was too real, too alive to be anything but a place out of time. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and something sweeter, something almost intoxicating, that clung to her skin as they walked deeper into the heart of the enchanted forest. The warriors moved ahead, their bodies fluid, their eyes alert. They were at ease in this strange place, their steps silent on the moss-covered ground. It was a world they seemed to know instinctively, their connection to the forest as natural as their connection to each other. Liara, on the other hand, felt like a trespasser. Every movement felt awkward, like the trees themselves were watching her, waiting to see if she belonged. The silence among them was broken only by the occasional rustling of leaves, the distant cry of some unseen creature, and the occasional grunt from one of the warriors as they navigated the underbrush. There was no need for words. Their communication was silent, instinctual. Subtle glances, slight gestures, and even the way they moved together spoke volumes. It was as if they were speaking an ancient language Liara was only beginning to understand. They had only gone a few paces into the heart of the forest when the first sign of magic made itself known. A low hum vibrated through the air, and Liara felt a shiver run down her spine. The ground beneath her feet seemed to shift, the earth itself twisting in subtle patterns. The trees around them creaked as if waking from a long slumber. One of the warriors, Roland, the one with the jagged scar running down his cheek, raised his hand, and the others stopped in their tracks. Liara felt a strange tension in the air, something charged, like a storm was gathering just out of sight. Roland's eyes flickered toward the trees, and then to the ground. The warriors moved in unison, their movements calculated and graceful as they fanned out. Liara was too slow to react. She barely saw it before it happened. A vine shot up from the ground, thick and fast, wrapping itself around her ankle. Before she could react, another vine snapped out from the shadows, coiling around her wrist. She gasped, struggling against the force that held her fast. The warriors were already on her, their movements swift and efficient. Roland's hand was at her shoulder in an instant, his touch surprisingly gentle despite the urgency of the situation. "Hold still," he commanded, his voice low but firm. Liara froze. The world felt like it was holding its breath. Roland's eyes met hers for just a moment, and for the first time since they had met there was something in his gaze that wasn't just the usual intensity. It was understanding. And something else. Something that felt like reassurance. The vine that held her wrist unravelled with a sharp snap, and Roland stepped back, his focus still on the movement of the forest around them. "That's nature's trap," he said quietly, as if explaining something simple. "Ancient magic. The forest doesn't like strangers. It tests those who pass through it." Liara looked at him, her breath still coming in sharp gasps. "Tests?" He nodded, his eyes scanning the shadows. "It's a warning. There will be more. Stay close. And don't break the bond." Liara didn't fully understand, but she felt the weight of his words. She could feel the presence of something unseen around them. The forest was watching, and it was waiting. As they moved deeper, Liara began to notice how the warriors interacted with the land around them. Roland made a small gesture to one of the others, and immediately another warrior, this one tall with dark eyes that always seemed to be watching, stepped forward. His hand brushed against a tree, leaving a faint mark carved into the bark. The air seemed to pulse around the mark, and the forest shifted, parting slightly to allow their path through. Liara watched, intrigued as the warriors moved with the precision that bordered on ritual. Every tree they passed, every stone they encountered was marked. It was as if the forest was theirs, each mark a small part of their history, a map of territory that had been passed down through generations. The connection they shared with this place was deeper than anything she had ever experienced. There was something in her, a feeling she couldn't shake, that made her wonder if she had always known that there was more, something that called to her, just like the bond she felt with them. These warriors, they weren't just part of her fate. They were her pack, and somehow she was part of theirs. She wasn't just walking in their world, she was starting to belong to it. Another howl split the air, sharper this time, and then another. It was a signal, a warning, but also something more. A call. The pack was moving, drawn by the same instinct that guided the warriors. They were moving in unison, linked by something primal and unspoken. Liara's chest tightened. The bond was getting stronger, and she couldn't ignore it anymore. She could feel their presence, like an ache in her bones, a tug on her soul. The warriors moved with purpose, their eyes scanning the trees for any sign of danger, their bodies taut and ready for whatever came next. And then, for the first time, she saw it. One of the warriors, the one with the dark, almost haunted eyes, turned his gaze to her. He didn't speak, but his eyes locked onto hers with an intensity that made the air around them crackle with energy. There was pain in his eyes, she could see it, but there was something else too, something raw and unspoken, something that made her heart beat faster. Hope, she thought. Hope that they weren't alone anymore. But it wasn't just his hope. It was hers too. As they pressed on, the forest around them seemed to grow quieter, the air thick with anticipation. They were moving forward, each step taking them deeper into the unknown, and with each step Liara felt the pull grow stronger, felt the bond she had been fighting tugging at her from the inside. There was no turning back now. The journey had only just begun. The air was still, too still, like the calm before a storm. The forest around them had grown quieter, the usual rustling of leaves and distant calls of birds muted, as if nature itself held its breath. Liara felt it first, a tingle on the back of her neck, a subtle shift in the atmosphere that made her senses sharpen. The warriors had already begun to move with purpose, their eyes scanning the shadows, their bodies poised for something she couldn't yet see. And then she heard it, a low chant. The words were ancient, but they cut through the air with a cruel sharpness that sent a chill down her spine. The warriors stiffened, their heads turning in unison toward the sound, their eyes narrowing in recognition. "They're here," Roland muttered, his voice low, his gaze fixed ahead. "Rival necromancers." Liara's hand instinctively went to the dagger at her side. She didn't need to be told twice. She could feel it. Dark magic, creeping into the world around them like smoke. The shadows broke apart, and figures emerged from the trees. They were cloaked, their faces hidden beneath hoods, their movements too fluid, too unnatural. Dark entities, their presence pulsing with malevolent energy. They were after something, and Liara knew exactly what it was. Her. Liara felt a sudden pressure in her chest as the dark figures drew closer, the air around her growing heavy with their magic. She could see it now. Glowing sigils burned into the ground beneath their feet, the edges of their robes rippling with an unnatural energy. "Stay back!" Roland barked at her, his eyes flashing with warning. But it was too late. The dark magic was already upon them. One of the necromancers raised his hand, and the ground cracked beneath Liara's feet, the earth groaning as if alive. Roots shot from the soil, wrapping themselves around her ankles, pulling her down. She gasped, her body fighting against the surge of magic, but it was too strong. She could feel it. The raw primal power of the necromancers pushing her down, trying to keep her bound. A low growl erupted from the warriors, and before Liara could react, Roland was at her side. With one swift motion he slashed through the roots, cutting the magic off at the source. The energy shifted, but the necromancers weren't done yet. They moved like shadows, circling them, closing in. Liara's heart raced. She had no choice now. She had to fight. "Focus!" Roland's voice cut through the chaos, sharp and urgent. "Use the power. Control it." The words pierced through the fog in her mind, but they didn't ease the fear twisting in her stomach. She could feel the magic surging through her. The raw, untamed energy that had been slowly growing since the moment she summoned the warriors. She had felt it before, but never like this. It was like a living thing, a creature that could turn on her at any moment. The necromancers were getting closer, their hands crackling with energy, their intentions clear. They didn't want to fight. They wanted to take. They wanted the power that was now coursing through her, the magic that was slowly becoming a part of her. Liara reached deep inside, forcing herself to calm the storm within. She focused on the energy, pulling it into herself, bending it to her will. Slowly it responded. The magic twisted, wrapping around her like a second skin. The power was there and she could feel it. But it wasn't just hers, it was shared. Shared with the warriors, shared with the land, shared with something older than all of them. With a single controlled motion, Liara thrust her hand forward. The air around her shimmered, the energy coalescing into a pulse of raw force. It struck the nearest necromancer, sending him tumbling backward, his grip on the magic faltering. But it wasn't enough. The others were closing in. They weren't backing down. Liara gritted her teeth, forcing more of the magic through her, pushing it out with every ounce of strength she had left. The ground beneath them seemed to grow restless, the trees creaking as the magic swirled, fighting against the necromancer's hold. And then a low rumble echoed through the forest, a deep, resonating growl that came from the very heart of the land. A flash of fur shot past Liara. The warriors were no longer standing still, they were moving in unison, a blur of movement, a pack hunting together. They fought with primal intensity, their bodies moving fluidly, instinctually, as though their very souls were tied to the land. Liara watched, awe mixing with fear, as they took on the necromancers. Their strength was overwhelming. Roland, with his fierce focus, dispatched another necromancer with a single strike. The others fought with equal ferocity, their movements in perfect sync. Liara wasn't left out. She fought beside them, her magic now responding to her commands, flowing with more control than she ever thought possible. But as the battle raged on, something unsettled her. She could feel the power, yes, but it was starting to feel like it was slipping through her fingers, like it might turn on her. She had always been a student of magic, always careful, always in control, but now the power was something wild, something untamed. And there was a part of her, buried deep down, that wondered if it would one day consume her. The last necromancer fell with a sharp cry, his body crumpling to the ground. The forest was silent once again, save for the soft rustling of the wind and the warrior's heavy breathing. Liara stood there, her chest heaving, her hands still crackling with residual magic. She was shaking, not from fear, but from the sheer intensity of what had just happened. She had held her own, she had fought, and yet the feeling lingered. The fear of the power inside her, the fear that it would one day turn on her, just like it had tonight. Before she could process it, a movement caught her eye. The warrior with the dark eyes, the one who had watched her since they first met, was looking at her. Their gazes locked, and for a moment time seemed to stretch. There was no need for words. She saw it in his eyes. Something raw, something hungry. The bond between them was undeniable, and it tugged at her heart like a tether, pulling her closer to him. But just as quickly, the moment passed. He turned away, his focus returning to the group, his body already moving toward the next task. But Liara's heart was still racing, her mind swirling with the weight of what had just happened. and what might come next. The battle was over, for now, but the war, both with the necromancers and with herself, was just beginning. Chapter 4. Into the Heart of Darkness. The Blackwood forest lived up to its name. A dense, oppressive canopy of ancient trees hung low, their twisted branches like fingers scratching at the sky. The very air was thick, heavy with a dampness that clung to Liara's skin, as if the forest itself was trying to suffocate her. No sunlight pierced the canopy, leaving the forest floor in near-constant twilight, the world muted in shades of grey and black. It was a place of silence, but not a comforting silence, the kind that felt like it had been there for centuries, pressing in on you from all sides. The trees loomed like sentinels, watching, waiting, their trunks gnarled and covered in moss, their roots twisting up from the ground like the veins of something ancient and alive. Liara's breath came shallow, her pulse quickening as the weight of the place pressed in on her. Every step she took felt like it might be her last, the underbrush thick and uneven, twisting in unnatural patterns. Each sound, the rustling of leaves, the snap of a twig, echoed unnervingly loud in the oppressive stillness. And somewhere, deep in the shadows, there were whispers. Low, haunting whispers that seemed to carry on the wind, speaking in a language she couldn't understand. She wasn't sure if they were real or if they were just the products of her imagination, but the effect was the same. The forest was alive, watching, and it didn't like her being here. The pack moved ahead, their bodies sleek and poised, moving with a grace that Liara couldn't match. They knew this place, the forest was theirs in a way that Liara could never claim. Their movements were fluid, instinctual, each warrior taking up his position, each step calculated, each eye watching the shadows. The air around them seemed to shift with a quiet hum, as though the trees were reacting to their presence.